had been planning a solo camping trip for months. After a long stretch of working from home and barely seeing anyone, I started to feel this growing pressure in my chest, like the walls were closing in. I just wanted to disappear for a while, disconnect from the internet, the news, the people, all of it. I didn't need a vacation in a hotel or a resort or a city full of noise. I wanted space. I wanted quiet. I wanted trees and wind and cold air. I wanted to go somewhere no one else was. So I started looking at maps online. Not just Google Maps, but old Forest Service websites, camping forums, scattered mentions on Reddit. I eventually found an unmarked area tucked between two ranger zones in northern Idaho. It looked like it had once been logged, but had grown back pretty thick. There weren't any trails nearby. The only mention of it I could find was a half-broken blog post from 10 years ago, where some guy talked about raw, empty forest and total solitude. That's what I wanted. Total solitude. I packed a cooler, filled up 2 jugs of water, loaded my pack with food, fire starter, my sleeping bag, and my tent. I had a Garmin GPS, a compass, a topographical map, and a backup battery pack. I had knives, a hatchet, a saw. I had a first aid kit. I overprepared because I knew how fast things could go wrong out there. I left early on a Thursday morning and drove almost 7 hours before I even got to the forest road. The last 60 miles were rough. Mostly dirt, barely maintained, washed out in places. It was already getting dark when I parked the truck in a clearing and hiked another 45 minutes into the trees before I finally made camp. I didn't hear a single engine, didn't see another light. Just me, the crunch of my boots on dead pine needles, and the rising cold. I set up camp quickly, pitched my small one-person tent, stacked some rocks to make a fire ring, and cleared the surrounding area of sticks and leaves. I got a small fire going before the last of the light vanished. Then I sat by it, watching the flames flicker, listening to the wind press through the trees. I could feel it in my chest. The silence, the stillness. It was exactly what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I ate, drank, stoked the fire until I got tired, and climbed into my sleeping bag. I left the tent flap unzipped and just lay there watching the stars. I barely slept but didn't mind. Just breathing fresh air made me feel better. The next morning I cooked oatmeal, cleaned up, and decided to explore. I left markers every few hundred feet, bright orange cloth tied to branches so I wouldn't lose my way. I followed a shallow ridge downhill for about half a mile, then veered off when I saw something strange near the base of a tree. It looked like the edge of an old metal container. I thought it might have been an old lunchbox or maybe an ammo can, rusted and barely sticking out of the dirt. I took my small shovel and started digging around it. The ground was soft, probably a pocket of loam where the leaves had built up. After about 15 minutes, I got it loose. It wasn't a lunchbox. It was a hard plastic case like the kind used for electronics, maybe 6 inches by 4 inches. There was duct tape around the edges and a strip of it across the top with something written in faded black Sharpie. Couldn't make it out. I peeled the tape off, popped the case open. Inside was a smartphone, at least 5 or 6 years old, scratched, dead. There was also a small charging cable and one of those little power banks with an old-style USB port. The bank was empty too. I thought it was strange that someone would bury a phone in the middle of nowhere. Stranger still that it was wrapped so carefully. I kept looking for a note or maybe a tag, but there was nothing else in the case. At first, I thought someone might have hidden it to protect data, or maybe it was part of a scavenger hunt or geocache, but something about it felt off. I didn't want to bring it back to camp, but I didn't want to leave it there either. I slipped the case into my pack and kept hiking. By the time I got back to my tent, the sun was already dropping. The temperature was falling fast. I boiled some rice and ate it with jerky, sitting close to the fire. I kept glancing at the case next to my pack. Eventually, I dug through my gear, found a small solar panel I had packed, and hooked it up to the power bank. I wasn't sure it would even charge anymore, but it lit up, so I left it there and went to bed. The next morning I checked it, and sure enough, the bank had a little bit of juice. I connected the phone. The screen stayed black at first, but after a minute, the battery icon flickered on. It was charging. I waited almost an hour before trying to power it on. When I pressed the button, the screen came to life. It booted up, showed a lock screen. No cell signal, obviously, but the time and date caught my eye: March 17th, 2019. Almost 6 years ago. There was a single notification. You have one unsent video. That's when the skin on the back of my neck started to prickle. I couldn't open anything. The phone was locked. No fingerprint, no PIN, just a basic keypad. I tried a few guesses: 1234, 0000, 2580, but no luck. I spent the rest of the day trying combinations off and on, but gave up after a while. That night, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees and made everything feel colder. I sat close to the fire, wrapped in my jacket. Every once in a while, I'd hear something move in the forest. Maybe an animal, maybe just the trees shifting. I told myself it was nothing. Still, I stayed awake longer than usual. At some point after midnight, I heard a faint beep. I thought maybe I imagined it. But then it happened again. A soft digital beep, like the sound of a phone alert. I grabbed the dead phone and pressed the button, but the screen stayed black. Then I realized the sound was coming from the power bank. The phone had powered itself on, and now it was unlocked. I stared at it, stunned. There was no passcode screen anymore, just the home screen with a few app icons. Messages, camera, gallery. That red bubble was still there. One unsent video. My hands were cold, but I tapped on the icon. The video was short, only 40 seconds. No title, just a timestamp. March 17th, 2019, 5:42 p.m. I hit play. The video was shaky, recorded in portrait mode. It looked like it was shot in the woods, maybe even the same forest. The person behind the camera was breathing heavily, fast. I could hear twigs snapping under their feet. They spun the camera around at one point, and I saw a flash of a trail, a large rock formation, and then something else, someone running. A man, wearing all black. His face was hidden under a hood or mask. He was carrying something. It looked heavy. The person recording whispered something, but there was no audio, only static. Then the camera jerked wildly, and the screen went black. That was it. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up camp and started hiking back to the truck. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every shadow looked wrong. I didn't stop to eat. Didn't even check the GPS more than once. I just kept moving. When I got to the clearing where I parked, my heart sank. There were tire tracks in the dirt, fresh ones. Someone else had been there. The problem was, I hadn't told anyone where I was going. No one. I rushed to the truck. It was locked. Everything looked normal, but the tracks didn't lie. Someone else had come down that road while I was deep in the woods. I drove out fast, didn't stop until I hit paved road. Then I kept going until I reached the nearest town with a police station. I walked in, explained I'd found a phone in the woods, and handed it over. I didn't say anything about the video. I just said I thought it might be evidence of something. They asked a few questions, wrote down my statement, and told me they'd take it from there. 2 weeks later, I got a call. A detective asked me to come in. I drove back to the town and met him in a small office at the back of the station. He showed me a still from the video, the frame with the man in black. They had identified him. He'd been a suspect in a missing person case from 2019. A hiker, a woman, had vanished without a trace. Her last known location had been somewhere near where I had camped. Her family had searched for weeks. Nothing had ever been found. Until now, the detective said the video changed everything. They were reopening the case. They asked me to point out exactly where I found the phone. I did. They sent a search team out 2 days later. They found her backpack buried under a pile of rocks, almost a mile from where I found the phone. A week after that, they found what was left of her body. The man in the video, he was already in jail, arrested on unrelated charges 2 years earlier. Now they had enough to charge him with murder. I don't know why the phone had never been found. Maybe he buried it thinking no one would ever go that deep into the woods. Maybe he never knew it was recording. Or maybe she turned it on just before whatever happened happened. I still think about it sometimes, What would have happened if I hadn't seen that edge of plastic? I took a week off from work in early September. It was still hot in Arizona, but not as bad as July or August. I had been planning the solo camping trip for a while. I needed to get away from the noise, the screens, and the stress. I wanted to clear my head, spend some time in nature, and maybe take a few pictures for the small photography page I ran online. I wasn't some expert outdoorsman, but I knew enough to be safe, or at least I thought I did. I had gone on solo trips before. Most of the time, it was uneventful. Some bugs, some wind, a sore back from sleeping on the ground. That was about the worst of it. I picked a spot about 2 hours south of Flagstaff, near a dry wash that ran between a few low ridges. There weren't any official campgrounds in that exact area, but it was all public land, and dispersed camping was allowed. It was one of those places where you drive down a dusty dirt road until you don't see anyone else around. Then you pull over and hike a little deeper into the trees. It felt like the kind of place nobody had visited for weeks. That's what I liked about it. I packed light but smart: tent, sleeping pad, water filter, first aid kit, enough food for 5 days, and a small solar panel to charge my phone in case of emergency. I had a GPS tracker that sent my location to a friend once a day, just to be safe. I always let someone know where I was going and when I planned to come back. I didn't like to take dumb risks, just peaceful ones. When I got there, it was around 10 in the morning. The sky was a perfect blue. No clouds, no wind, just a dry warmth that made your skin feel like it was baking if you stood in the sun too long. I parked off the side of a dirt road, shouldered my pack, and hiked about 2 miles into the ridges. I didn't see a single person the entire time, just cactus, dry bushes, and patches of old juniper trees with their gray bark peeling off in strips. The ground was cracked and dusty, with bits of shale and bone-dry sand everywhere. I found a small natural hollow surrounded by some larger rocks and a few twisted trees. It gave some shade, and the terrain was flat enough to pitch my tent. The hollow also had a short slope that led down to the dry wash. Even though there was no water in it now, it looked like it had flowed sometime earlier that year. I could see little piles of driftwood and old debris half buried in the sand. After setting up camp, I ate a granola bar and wandered around with my camera. I like taking pictures of things most people wouldn't notice. Textures in rocks, insect trails in the dust, faded animal prints. I kept seeing broken branches that looked like something had moved through recently, but I figured it was probably deer or javelina. I didn't feel nervous. In fact, it was the calmest I had felt in months. Later that afternoon, I was exploring the edge of the dry wash when I saw something sticking out of the sand. At first I thought it was just another piece of driftwood, but the shape was wrong. It was too smooth, too uniform. It looked like a piece of plastic or maybe metal. It had a corner and a flat surface. I got closer and knelt down, brushing away some of the dry sand. It was a container, something rectangular and man-made. I dug around it slowly with my fingers. It took a while because the sand had hardened around it from when the wash was wet. Eventually, I got it out. It was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, painted green, scratched and dirty, but still sealed. It had a small latch on one side and what looked like an old, rusty lock hanging from it. I turned it over, trying to see if there were any markings, but there weren't. Just an old sticker on the bottom, half peeled off. No numbers, no names. I know now I should have left it there, just buried it back or walked away. But at the time, my mind started racing. Who buries a box like that out in the middle of nowhere? Was it lost? Hidden? Was it old military stuff? Drugs? Money? I couldn't help myself. I put it in my backpack and hiked back to my tent. I didn't try to open it right away. I left it by my gear while I made dinner, some freeze-dried noodles and beans. The sun dropped fast, and the desert got cold like it always does. That night, I sat by a little campfire I built with twigs and dry wood. I turned the box over again, inspecting it in the firelight. I finally decided to break the lock. It was so rusted I didn't even need tools, just a rock and some pressure. The lock cracked off. I lifted the lid. Inside was a thick Ziploc bag, yellowed with age, and inside the bag were papers. Dozens of them, folded and stacked. Some looked like printed forms. Others were handwritten notes. There were also a few small photographs, black and white ones like from an old instant camera. The photos were dark, grainy. One looked like it showed the side of a warehouse or trailer. Another had what looked like a dirt airstrip. One showed a man, standing next to a plane, his face turned slightly away from the camera. The papers were worse. They were in English mostly, but some had other languages too, maybe Spanish or Portuguese. One sheet listed names and numbers in a table. It looked like flight logs, maybe. Another page had coordinates written over and over, like someone had tried to memorize them. There were also 2 pages that looked like instructions or reports. One was stamped in faded red ink. I couldn't read all of it, but I saw phrases like cargo not secured, route diversion requested, and disposal confirmed. It hit me then that I had probably stumbled into something I really wasn't supposed to see. This wasn't just trash or forgotten junk. Somebody had put effort into hiding this box. The fact that it was still sealed, still in decent shape, meant it hadn't been there forever. And the contents didn't look like something anyone would bury on accident. I packed everything back into the bag and sealed the box. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing sounds, branches cracking, wind shifting, sand moving. I kept looking out the tent flap, scanning the dark. I finally drifted off around 3 or 4 in the morning, but I never really felt rested. The next morning, I decided I'd stay just one more day and then head out early. Something about the box made me feel like I'd crossed a line. The peace I came looking for was gone. I didn't feel like I was alone out there anymore. I kept looking up at the ridge lines, scanning for movement. I didn't see anyone, but I had this crawling feeling in my gut that I couldn't shake. I spent most of that day hiking further away from camp, trying to clear my head. When I got back near dusk, I noticed something was off. There were fresh boot prints around my tent. Not mine. They were wider, heavier. Someone had been there while I was gone. Nothing was missing, but the box had been moved. I had left it under my sleeping bag inside the tent. Now it was outside, leaning against the fire pit. I felt my chest tighten. I looked around the trees, the wash, the hills. Nothing, just the same dead stillness. I packed the box back into my bag and kept it with me the rest of the night. I didn't light a fire. I didn't eat. I just sat against a rock with my headlamp on low, staring into the dark. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard footsteps. Once, I swear I saw a faint light up on the ridge, like a tiny flashlight beam. It was gone before I could even fully register it. At first light, I packed everything in record time. I didn't even eat breakfast. I hiked hard, fast, not stopping to rest. I kept expecting to see someone following me. At one point, I thought I heard an engine way off in the distance, but it faded. When I got back to my truck, I locked the doors immediately and drove straight to the nearest gas station, about an hour and a half away. I used their bathroom, got water, and tried to think clearly. I thought about throwing the box in a dumpster right there, just ditching it, but I couldn't. Felt like it had its hooks in me now. Instead, I drove home. Once I was back in my apartment, I spread the contents out on my table. I took pictures of everything with my phone and backed them up to a hard drive. I still didn't fully understand what I had found, but the more I looked, the more it felt like some kind of black market or government operation. Smuggling, maybe. The dates on some of the papers were recent, within the last 3 years. I sent anonymous emails to 2 journalists I had followed online. I used burner accounts, no names, no attachments, just short descriptions and offers to share more. Only one of them replied. I sent her the photos. She never responded again. 2 days later, someone rang the buzzer to my apartment at 3 in the morning. They didn't say anything. I didn't answer. I just watched the camera feed. A man stood there in a black hoodie for about a minute, then left. That day, I mailed the box, contents and all, to a P.O. box I had rented under a fake name. Then I left town. I moved north, changed numbers, deleted social accounts. I still haven't gone camping again. I don't think I ever will, but sometimes I still feel like I'm being watched. And I still have one of the photos, the one with the man by the plane. I kept it hidden, folded between 2 pages of a book, just in case. I didn't have any real reason for going camping when I did. It was the middle of September, and the weather had just started cooling down after a long, humid summer. I wasn't going through a breakup, I hadn't lost my job, and nobody in my life had died recently, but something still felt off. I'd been working from home too long, stuck in my small apartment with no real routine besides sitting at a screen all day. I wasn't sleeping right. I was anxious for no reason. Every time I opened the fridge, I stood there staring for 5 minutes before closing it again. My brain just felt foggy and slow, so I figured I needed to get away. Not a hotel, not a city trip, not a resort. I needed quiet. No phone, no people, just me, some food, my tent, and the woods. I picked a national forest about 4 hours away from where I lived. I'd been to this area once before a couple years ago. I remembered the hiking was good, the mountains were peaceful, and most of the time you wouldn't run into another person for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed up my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, water purifier, bear spray, dehydrated food, a cheap camp stove, my knife, and an old GPS I hadn't used in a while. I also had my phone, but I planned to keep it turned off. I didn't even bring a charging cable. I left on a Thursday morning. Traffic wasn't bad, and by early afternoon, I was pulling off the narrow forest road that led to one of the lesser-known trailheads. I parked, got out, and just stood for a while. The air was sharp and cool, pine trees all around. No sound except wind and maybe the occasional bird. I took a deep breath and felt like I was doing the right thing. The first few hours of hiking felt great. I moved slow, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to. I wasn't in a rush. The trail was steep in some places, rocky in others, but overall not too difficult. I had marked out a spot on my map about 6 miles in where I planned to set up camp. It was an open flat ledge that overlooked a big valley and had a stream not far downhill. I reached it around 5 p.m. and got everything set up just before sunset. Tent up, water filtered, stove running. I sat on a rock and ate my sad little pouch of beef stew while watching the sky go orange and then deep purple. I hadn't felt that calm in a long time. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. I woke up around 7, packed my gear into a bear bag, and strung it high up between 2 trees a bit downhill. Then I headed out for a long hike with just a day pack. I planned to make a big loop that would take me through a few ridges and back around to my camp by late afternoon. The woods stayed quiet for most of the day. I saw a deer early on and some chipmunks near one of the clearings. Around lunchtime, I stopped near a large flat rock and sat down to rest. That was when I noticed something strange. It was a boot print. Not mine. Not fresh either, but not that old. Deep heel, slightly worn tread. Looked like someone had passed through maybe a day or 2 before. That shouldn't have been odd. People hiked these woods. But something about it bothered me. I hadn't seen a single person on the trail all day. Not a hiker, not a camper, not even an old fire ring or trash that people sometimes leave behind. The boot print was pointing off trail, into a patch of brush where there wasn't a path. I stood there a minute trying to tell myself it was nothing. Probably just someone bushwhacking or hunting. But the thought stuck with me. I got back to my camp around 4. Nothing had been disturbed. The food bag was still up in the trees. Tent looked fine, but I couldn't shake this nervous feeling that had started crawling in my chest. That night, I went to sleep early again, but I kept waking up every couple hours. I didn't hear anything. There was no sound of movement, no sticks breaking, no footsteps, just wind. But every time I opened my eyes, I felt like something was different. Not wrong exactly, just changed. Like something had shifted outside my tent while I was asleep. The next morning, I found what it was. There were footprints, not mine, and not just 1 or 2. They were around the camp, barely noticeable unless you were looking, slightly deeper where the ground was soft. At first, I thought I might have made them the day before and just forgotten, but they were too long. The stride was different, wider. They led from the trees at the edge of the ledge around behind the tent, and then back down toward the slope where my food bag was hung. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. My heart started racing, but I didn't move. I didn't want to believe it. Then I checked the bear bag. Still there, still tied, food untouched. But now the branch it was tied to was bent, like someone had pulled on the rope. I looked around the woods, slowly, carefully, trying not to panic. There was nobody in sight, no movement, no noise, just trees and wind. But I felt watched. That was the worst part. Not the footprints, not the rope, the feeling in my neck like someone was looking at me through the trees. I didn't eat breakfast. I just packed everything, fast, took down the tent, stuffed everything into my bag, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. It was only 6 miles, but I pushed hard. I kept checking behind me, listening, stopping every few minutes. Nothing, but I couldn't stop shaking. I didn't even turn my phone on. I just wanted to get to the car. I made it back by early afternoon. Still no one around. The parking lot was empty except for my car. But as I walked across the dirt toward it, I saw something that made my chest go tight. The back window was smeared with something. Mud, a handprint, long fingers, big palm. It had been touched. I checked the doors. Locked. Nothing missing inside. But someone had come up to my car. I drove home without stopping once. Didn't even eat. I just needed to get out of there. But this story doesn't end there. The next day, I couldn't sit still. My brain kept going back to the handprint, the boot tracks, the bent branch. I didn't feel safe in my own apartment. I kept checking the locks. I pulled the curtains closed. I didn't sleep that night either. Then something happened that made everything worse. My neighbor, who lived in the apartment across from mine, came by the next afternoon to ask if I'd had visitors. She said she heard footsteps outside my door around 2 a.m. but didn't see anyone. I said no, I hadn't had anyone over. But that sick feeling came back. I checked the hallway camera. Our building had a motion camera in the hall. It didn't record all the time, just when someone moved past. There was a clip from 1:57 a.m. A man walked slowly past my door. Tall, thin, wearing a hood. Couldn't see his face. He stopped in front of my door for several seconds, then walked away. That was the moment when I knew for sure this wasn't over. I called the police, filed a report, showed them the clip. They said they'd patrol the area more often, but there wasn't much they could do. No break-in, no crime, just a guy in a hallway. I didn't go back to work for a few days. I couldn't concentrate. I kept thinking he was going to come back. I kept thinking about the footprints, the rope, the car window. I kept wondering how he had found out where I lived. That's when I remembered something that chilled me even more. Before the trip, when I was marking spots on my map, I had posted a photo of the area on a hiking forum. It wasn't much, just a screenshot of the route I planned to take, with the trailhead circled. I had posted it asking if anyone had done it recently. The post had my username. My profile had my city listed. Anyone with the time could have figured out where I lived. That night, I deleted everything. The post, my profile, all of it. I bought a security camera and put it inside my apartment, facing the door. I didn't leave the place for days. I even started keeping a hammer next to the bed. Then nothing happened. Days went by. A week, 2 weeks. No sign of anyone. No noises in the night. The cops said they hadn't seen anything unusual in the area. Eventually, I started relaxing again. I still felt uneasy, but life slowly went back to normal. Then, 3 weeks after I got home, I checked the footage on my camera out of habit. There was a clip from 3:12 a.m. No sound, just motion. It was me, asleep in bed. The footage was from the night before, but I had turned the camera off before going to sleep. I know for a fact I had turned it off. I never leave it running while I'm sleeping. It makes a small light that I can't stand at night. I always shut it off before bed, but the footage was there. I stared at the screen for almost an hour trying to make sense of it. Then I saw something else. At the 24-minute mark of the recording, something moved in the hallway, just barely in frame. A shadow passed by the crack under my door. Quick, almost like a flash of darkness. That was when I broke down. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I packed. I put every important thing I had into 2 bags, drove 6 hours to my brother's place out of state, and didn't tell anyone I was coming. I stayed there for a month. Eventually, I got a new apartment in a different town, new lot. I had been planning that solo camping trip for almost 5 months. I kept putting it off for one reason or another: work, friends, money, weather. But by late September, I decided I wasn't going to wait anymore. I had a few days saved up from work, and the temperature was dropping just enough for the bugs to ease off, but not so cold that I'd be miserable at night. I packed my old gear, drove out early on a Thursday, and headed north toward the Ridge Country, about 4 hours out of town. I'd gone hiking in that area once with a group years back. I remembered long trails, dry pine needles underfoot, that sort of dry, whispering wind that makes you think you're alone but not forgotten. I wasn't worried. I wasn't some clueless beginner. I'd camped alone before, and this time I had better gear, more food, and a lighter pack. I even brought one of those small solar chargers for emergencies, even though I planned to keep my phone off most of the time. The Ridge area wasn't maintained like the more popular parks. There were no maps handed out at a booth, no rangers walking the trails. Just long forest roads, switchbacks that twisted through mountains, and worn-down trails that weren't always marked. That's what I liked about it. I wanted space. I didn't want to see people. I didn't want noise. I wanted to be away from phones and work and obligations and people. I thought it would clear my head. I thought it would relax me. I found a place to park off an old forest road, where the gravel had turned mostly into grass and roots. I knew the creek wasn't far. The plan was to hike in about 4 miles, cut slightly off the trail toward a flat spot I remembered near the edge of the ridge, camp there for 3 nights, maybe walk down to the creek and fish a little. Simple. No distractions. Just quiet. The first day was smooth. The sun was out, the forest floor had that dry, dusty feel to it. I moved slow, took water breaks, and followed the GPS map I downloaded just to be sure. The trail was easy to follow most of the way, though it narrowed and twisted more than I expected the deeper I went. Around mid-afternoon, I found the spot. Flat, dry, with a nice open area for the tent. I remembered it from before. It had a small log I could use as a bench and a line of thick trees on one side to break the wind. I set up camp, boiled some water for dinner, and watched the sun go down behind the ridge. The sky turned soft and pink, and the shadows grew longer. I had a good view of the valley from there, though the trees blocked most of it. I didn't build a fire the first night. I didn't think I needed one. I just sat in my chair and listened to the wind pass through the trees, watched the light fade, and felt that kind of peace I'd been hoping for. It was cold, but not freezing. I had a solid sleeping bag and wore 2 layers inside the tent. I slept fine. The next morning, I had oatmeal and coffee, then followed the small trail that led downhill toward the creek. It was steeper than I remembered. The dry leaves made it slick, and I slid a few times, caught myself on branches. I took it slow, careful not to twist anything. Down near the water, the trees grew thicker and the light barely broke through. The creek itself wasn't wide, maybe 6 or 7 feet across, but the water was moving fast. The banks were lined with fallen branches and mossy rocks. I sat down near a bend in the creek and tried fishing for a while, but nothing bit. Still, it was peaceful. I sat there for almost an hour, just watching the water. That was the last time I felt completely at ease. As I hiked back up to camp that afternoon, I noticed something strange just past the halfway point on the trail. What looked like a set of footprints, very faint, maybe half a dozen of them in the loose dirt. They weren't mine. They were heading downhill, not up, and they weren't there when I'd come down earlier. I froze and just stared at them for a few seconds. They were boot prints, not barefoot, but still they looked off. The stride was too long, and they dug in like whoever made them was walking fast or even running. I bent down, trying to measure the size with my hand. They were longer than mine by maybe 2 inches. Could have been a hiker. Could have been someone else out here. But it bothered me. I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't seen anyone. And this trail wasn't near anything. The closest cabin I knew of was almost 10 miles away, near the road. I looked around but didn't see anyone or hear anything. So I kept going, kept climbing. The wind was blowing again, and it felt stronger than the day before. It was almost like it carried sound away instead of bringing it. Back at camp, I sat for a long time, staring at the woods. I didn't like that someone had come down that path. Maybe they'd turned off before reaching the creek. Maybe they didn't even see me, but I didn't like that they were so close without me knowing. I set up a small fire that evening, just to feel more secure. I ate a bit, sat beside the flames, and kept looking into the woods. Everything was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something's waiting for you to let your guard down. I stayed up until the fire burned low, then got in the tent and zipped it tight. I left the hatchet close by just in case. That night, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, just a soft crunch of leaves or twigs, but it was real. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes, frozen in place. Then it came again. A slow, dragging sound. Not footsteps. More like something being pulled or pushed across the forest floor. I couldn't tell how far it was. Maybe 30 feet. Maybe more. I sat up and reached for the hatchet. My chest was pounding, but the sound stopped. Just like that. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. I didn't hear anything else the rest of the night, but I didn't sleep either. I laid there, staring into the dark, heart racing every time the wind moved the tent. I thought about getting up and looking outside, but I couldn't bring myself to unzip the flap. I just waited. Eventually, the sky turned gray and I heard birds again. I crawled out, looked around, didn't see anything out of place. Nothing had been touched. No footprints, no signs of movement. But I knew what I'd heard. I told myself it could have been an animal. A deer, maybe, or a bear passing by. But it hadn't sounded like that. It had sounded human. I spent most of that day just around camp. I didn't go back down to the creek. I kept scanning the tree line, trying to see if anything moved. I barely ate. I couldn't shake that feeling in my chest, that creeping pressure like something was off, something was watching. I thought about packing up and hiking back to the car, but I told myself I was overreacting. I hadn't seen anything. I hadn't heard it again. I decided to stay one more night, just one more. If anything else happened, I'd leave first thing in the morning. That evening, I set a bigger fire. I sharpened the edge of the hatchet. I stacked wood beside the pit so I wouldn't have to move far to keep it going. I sat there until well past midnight, staring into the flames. Then I heard it, not from the woods, from behind me. It was a low thump, like something hitting the ground. I turned fast, hatchet in hand. I couldn't see anything. The trees behind me were thick. I stepped around the fire to get a better angle. Still nothing, but I knew I'd heard it. That's when I noticed something different. One of the branches on the ground, just a long, dead piece of pine, was broken in half, like it had been stepped on. I hadn't seen it like that earlier. I walked slowly over to it. There was a faint mark in the dirt beside it. A boot tread. I backed up, heart pounding, eyes scanning everywhere. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just outside the light of the fire, just beyond where I could see. I didn't go in the tent that night. I sat by the fire until the sun came up. I added wood every 30 minutes just to stay awake, just to keep the light going. As soon as there was enough daylight, I packed everything. I didn't even eat. I jammed my gear into the pack, half-zipped some of it, and started walking back toward the car. I moved fast, checking behind me every few minutes, ears straining for sounds that never came. The trail felt longer on the way back. The switchbacks seemed steeper. My legs burned, my shoulders ached, but I didn't stop. I made it back to the forest road by early afternoon. The car was untouched. I loaded the gear, got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time before turning the key. My hands were shaking. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What would I even say? That I heard footsteps? That I saw one boot print? That someone was maybe following me for 2 days without making themselves known? I didn't have photos. I didn't have proof. But I knew what I'd felt. I knew how wrong it had felt. About a week later, I looked up news articles from the area. I didn't expect to find anything, but there was one post from a local hiking forum. someone asking if the trails in that area were safe. They said their dog had started acting weird near the ridge trail, wouldn't stop barking. They'd cut their trip short. No one else had responded. A month after that, I read a report that a hiker had gone missing a few miles from where I'd camped. No trace found. Search was ongoing. I don't know why I always ignore that feeling in my gut. I think maybe part of me likes pretending nothing bad can happen if I just don't think about it. But this time it was different. This time I paid for it in a way that I won't ever forget. It all started with a long weekend and a need to get away from people. I live in a small apartment in a busy town, and even though I like being near everything, sometimes the noise just piles up in my head. Sirens in the distance, people yelling outside at night, the thump of music through the wall from the neighbor next door. I'd had enough. It was a Friday morning in late September. The air had just started to cool. The leaves on the trees weren't fully turned yet, but they had that faded green look like they were about to. I loaded up my car with everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, cooler with food, folding chair, flashlight, a hatchet for firewood, and some other odds and ends. I also had a small propane stove and a big jug of water, since the place I was going to didn't have any facilities. I was planning on doing it rough. No bathrooms, no other people, just me, the woods, and some peace and quiet. The spot I had in mind was about 4 hours north of where I live. It wasn't part of a formal campground. It was just this patch of woods I had found a year before when I was driving through back roads with no plan. I'd seen a small dirt path that led off the main gravel road, and out of curiosity I'd followed it. After about 10 minutes of bumping over roots and dodging potholes, I'd come to a clearing that sat next to a narrow creek. I'd only stayed for one night that time, but I remembered how quiet it was. I hadn't seen another soul the whole time I was there, so I headed back there, thinking it would be perfect. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I had mentioned to a friend earlier in the week that I was thinking of camping that weekend, but I didn't give details. At the time, I didn't think it mattered. I figured I'd be back Sunday evening, rested and reset. It was just camping. I'd done it plenty of times before. The drive up was smooth. I stopped once to fill up my tank and grab a sandwich, then kept going. The road got narrower the farther I went, the town smaller, the cell signal weaker. By the time I got near the area I was looking for, I had one bar, and it kept flickering in and out. I didn't mind. I wanted to unplug anyway. I found the same dirt path as before. The trees had grown in some since last year, and a few fallen branches made it tougher to navigate, but I took it slow. I reached the clearing by late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and the air had that crisp, earthy smell that only comes with the end of summer. I parked my car near the edge of the clearing, got out, and took a long look around. It looked exactly as I remembered it. Dense trees all around, tall grasses near the creek, the water moving slow and quiet over rocks and fallen leaves. I set up my tent in the center of the clearing, making sure the ground was flat. Then I gathered some firewood from the edges of the woods and set up a small pit. I didn't plan on having a big fire, just enough to stay warm and cook. As night came on, I made some canned soup on the propane stove, sat in my folding chair with a headlamp on, and listened to the sounds around me. Crickets whined through leaves, the occasional rustle from an animal in the brush. It was peaceful. I stayed up until the fire burned low, then climbed into my sleeping bag inside the tent. That first night, I slept pretty well. A couple of times I woke up because I heard something outside, branches snapping or leaves rustling. But that's normal in the woods. Animals move around at night. I wasn't worried. I drifted back off both times and woke up around 7 the next morning. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside into the cold air. I could see my breath. The grass was damp with dew. I boiled some water for instant coffee and had a granola bar while walking along the edge of the creek. Around mid-morning, I decided to hike deeper into the woods. I brought a small day pack with water, a snack, and my folding knife. I also marked the trees near camp with a strip of orange tape so I wouldn't get lost coming back. I didn't have a map of the area, it wasn't an official trail system, but I figured if I followed the creek for a while and then turned around, I'd be fine. The hike was peaceful. I didn't see any large animals, but I saw signs, tracks, droppings, claw marks on a tree, probably deer or maybe a black bear, but nothing fresh. I walked for a couple of hours, then turned back. When I got to camp, everything looked the same. Nothing had been touched. I ate lunch, then read a book in my chair for most of the afternoon. It was later that day, just before sunset, that I started feeling off. Not scared exactly, just watched. I'd gone to the edge of the clearing to relieve myself, and as I stood there, I had this tight feeling in my chest. The woods seemed too quiet all of a sudden. I looked around, saw nothing, but I took a long, slow walk around the perimeter of the clearing just to make sure. I didn't find anything out of place. Maybe a couple of branches broken in odd ways, but nothing that couldn't be explained by wind or animals. Still, the feeling didn't go away. That night, I made another small fire and warmed up a can of chili. I tried to push the weird feeling out of my head. Maybe I was just getting inside my own mind. I hadn't spoken to anyone in almost 2 days, hadn't looked at my phone once, hadn't seen another human being. It's easy to start imagining things when you're that isolated. Still, I kept my knife close when I went into the tent, just in case. That night was not like the first. I woke up around 1 a.m. to a noise, something that sounded like a branch snapping, but louder and closer than before. I held still, listening. My tent was zipped shut, and the inside was completely dark. I kept the headlamp near my hand, but I didn't turn it on yet. I heard something else, footsteps, maybe slow, heavy ones. Not an animal rustling, not the sound of something four-legged. These were distinct, spaced apart, like someone walking. My heart was pounding. I held my breath and listened harder. The footsteps circled the tent once, then stopped. I could hear nothing but my own heartbeat in my ears. Then nothing, just silence. No retreating steps, no voice, no sound of someone walking away. Just dead silence. I stayed awake for at least an hour, too afraid to move, gripping the knife. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again, because I woke up to light coming through the tent wall. I got out quickly and looked around. The ground outside was damp and soft, perfect for tracks. I walked slowly, eyes scanning, and sure enough, about 10 feet from the tent, near the tree line, were prints. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. Human. They weren't mine. I hadn't been barefoot once since I got here. They were wide, long, and deeply pressed into the earth. They circled around behind the tent and vanished into the woods. I stood there for a long time. My stomach felt hollow. I suddenly realized how far I was from any help. No cell signal, no one knew exactly where I was, and no way to reach anyone if something went wrong. I considered leaving right then, packing up and driving home, but something in me pushed back. I told myself maybe it had been someone passing through, unlikely but not impossible. Maybe a squatter, maybe a hiker, maybe someone who didn't even realize I was there. I stayed. I made coffee, skipped breakfast, and kept a close eye on the trees. That day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed close to camp, checked over all my supplies, and kept the fire going just to have something warm and visible. That night, I didn't sleep in the tent. I took my sleeping bag into the car and locked the doors. I reclined the seat and kept the knife in my lap, staring out the windshield until my eyes drooped closed. Nothing happened that night. No footsteps, no noises. But the next morning, I found something that made my blood turn cold. A small pile of rocks, neatly stacked about a foot tall, sat right in front of my tent. It hadn't been there the night before. Someone had come into my camp again, while I slept in the car just feet away, and left that for me to find. I started packing the second I saw it. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about anything except leaving. I took down the tent in 10 minutes flat, threw everything into the trunk, and got behind the wheel. As I drove down the dirt path, my hands shook on the steering wheel. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the clearing watching me go. I didn't relax until I hit the main road and saw other cars. Even then, I kept scanning the mirrors. I drove straight home, no stops, no music, nothing. When I got back, I took the longest shower of my life and sat on the edge of the bed just staring at the floor. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep well. Every noise in the apartment made me jump. I kept seeing those bare footprints in my head, kept imagining someone out there in the woods watching me, following me, waiting until I was asleep to come close. I started carrying a small knife in my pocket even when I went to the grocery store. I started locking every door, every window, even during the day. I reported what happened to the local sheriff's office, just in case. They said I don't go camping anymore. Not alone, not with friends, not in groups, not even in the safety of organized campgrounds with bathrooms and RV hookups. I sold my tent. I sold my backpack. I still get sick to my stomach when I see photos of forests or hear the sound of wind in pine trees. I know how stupid it sounds to some people, especially the ones who think they're invincible just because they have a compass, a lighter, or some wilderness experience. But if you've ever felt the kind of fear that leaves you changed at your core, you know that instincts aren't there for decoration. They're warnings, and ignoring them almost cost me everything. It started in mid-September, when the trees had just started changing color, and the nights were getting colder. That time of year always felt special to me, like nature was turning in for the season. I was 27, in decent shape, and had been solo camping and hiking on and off for about 5 years. I wasn't an expert survivalist, but I wasn't green either. I liked the solitude, the quiet, the disconnect from all the fake stuff in daily life. No phones ringing, no emails, no people. Just me and nature. That was always the appeal. I chose a spot in northern Idaho, not far from the Canadian border. It was remote, about a 6-hour drive from where I lived. I had found a lesser-known area through a backcountry forum, something someone mentioned in passing, not an official trail or campsite, but a place a few experienced hikers had explored and described as peaceful, beautiful, and quiet. That's exactly what I wanted. The name wasn't even official. It was just labeled as Stone Ridge Basin in a comment thread. No coordinates, just vague directions like past the old fire road and down into the second ravine past the dry creek. That should have been the first sign. I planned for 4 nights out there. The forecast was clear. I packed all the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag rated for freezing temps, water filtration system, food for 5 days, bear spray, a hunting knife, a good flashlight, extra batteries, a headlamp, paracord, a whistle, a GPS beacon, and a paper map just in case. I let my buddy James know my general plan and said I'd check in when I got back. The plan was simple. Get to the fire road by late afternoon, hike into the basin before sundown, set up camp, spend a few days hiking and enjoying the quiet, then hike back out. The drive-in was long and quiet. After the last town, I didn't see another car for nearly an hour. The gravel fire road was rough and overgrown, with weeds scraping against the undercarriage of my SUV. I parked in a small pull-off just before the road narrowed too much for my vehicle. From there, I hiked in with my full pack. The trail wasn't marked, and it wasn't really a trail either. It was more like a deer path, narrow and often lost in thick undergrowth. But I had paid close attention to the directions I'd found online, and I had marked the landmarks on my map. I reached the edge of the basin just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The air cooled fast. The ground dropped into a wide, bowl-shaped area lined with dense pine and birch trees, some already golden and red. There was a small, still pond near the center, reflecting the pinkish-orange sky. No trash, no signs of people, just birds, wind, and the faint gurgle of water nearby. Perfect. I set up camp on a slight rise about 50 yards from the pond. The ground was dry and flat. I cleared out any debris, pitched my tent, and got my bear bag ready with all my scented items. I hung it high between 2 trees far from my tent, just like I'd done on every solo trip. I had a small camp stove, but I didn't use it the first night. I ate a cold protein bar and drank water from the filtered bottle, then sat against a log and watched the stars appear. I felt that peaceful stillness I always looked forward to. My heart rate slowed. My breathing softened. I felt okay, but I never slept well the first night in the woods, and that night was no different. I dozed on and off, mostly listening to the wind and the occasional snapping of branches in the distance. Nothing unusual. Forests are full of sounds. I told myself that every time I woke up, heart pounding, The second day, I hiked out from camp to explore the area. The basin was surrounded by steep, rocky ridges on 3 sides. I followed the dry creek bed down one slope and found a bunch of moose tracks. I knew they were fresh. The indentations were deep, and the edges were still sharp. I found some scat too, big piles, still steaming in the cold morning air. That meant the moose was close. I didn't want to spook it, so I turned back. Back at camp, I made some tea and sat by the water. I remember feeling a little off, but I couldn't explain it. Nothing specific, just an odd feeling, like I was being watched, even though I hadn't seen a single person since I left the car. I brushed it off, told myself it was just my nerves. I'd had that feeling before, and it always passed. That night, I heard something that made me sit bolt upright in my sleeping bag. It was a thud, not a branch falling, not a pine cone, a heavy, dull thud, like something big had dropped onto soft ground. Came from somewhere near the pond. Then silence. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No animals scurrying. No wind. Then I heard a splash. It was quick, like something stepping into shallow water. I sat there, holding the zipper of my tent, knife in my lap. Every part of me wanted to get out and look, but every part of me also said don't. I stayed like that for nearly an hour, knife in hand, eyes straining to hear more. Eventually, I drifted into a light sleep, still sitting upright. When I woke up, the sun was already rising. I got out of the tent slowly, scanning the area. Nothing was disturbed. My bear bag was untouched. The pond looked the same. I told myself maybe it was a moose or deer walking through. Maybe it had slipped or stepped into the water. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't hike far that day, just circled the basin. I kept glancing back toward the pond, toward the ridge, expecting to see movement. I didn't. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. I kept hearing small snapping sounds, twigs, leaves, but I could never tell the direction they were coming from. It was like the sound bounced off the trees. I felt exposed, even though I couldn't see anyone. I kept the knife clipped to my belt the whole time. That was a first for me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the tent unzipped halfway so I could look out. The moonlight was bright, casting shadows between the trees. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat with my back against my pack, knife in my lap, bear spray in hand. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard something again. This time it was slower, softer. Asterisk, asterisk footsteps. Asterisk, asterisk, but they weren't the fast, light steps of a deer or the thudding of a moose. These were careful, spaced out, deliberate. 4 or 5 steps, then silence. Then 3 more, then nothing. It sounded like someone walking barefoot on pine needles. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then I heard it again. Asterisk, asterisk, a low, dragging sound. Asterisk, asterisk, it didn't make sense. Nothing drags in the forest unless it's carrying something or hurt. But the steps were strong, steady, not limping. I didn't sleep after that. When the sun came up, I made the decision to leave early. I had 2 more nights planned, but I felt like I was running out of time. Something was wrong, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it was. I packed everything quickly, didn't even eat breakfast. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder. I still didn't see anything, but that dragging sound played in my head over and over. As I left the basin, I noticed something I hadn't seen on the way in. A large tree, maybe 50 feet from where my tent had been, had deep gouges in the bark. Not bear claw marks, these were vertical but thin, like made with a blade. About chest height. They weren't there before. I was sure of that. The trail back up the ridge was harder going out. My legs felt heavy. I kept thinking I heard movement behind me, but every time I stopped, it stopped too. I finally made it back to the fire road by early afternoon. When I got to my car, there was mud on the back window. Just one swipe, diagonal, thick, smeared. I hadn't driven through any mud. The trail was dry. The swipe was about 3 feet long, thick in the middle and tapering at both ends. It looked like someone had run their palm across the glass with force. I didn't wait. I got in and drove, and I didn't stop until I hit pavement 3 hours later. When I got home, I unpacked everything and checked it all. My gear was untouched. My GPS beacon had no alerts. My phone had no messages, but I kept seeing that muddy swipe in my head, that dragging sound, those careful, slow steps in the dark. A few days later, I went back on the forum where I found the mention of Stone Ridge Basin. I tried to find the original post, but it was gone. The user who posted it had deleted their account. I searched the whole thread. Nothing, like it was never there. I don't usually camp alone, but that weekend I needed to get away from everything. Things had been building up for a while. Work stress, a breakup, and just the general noise of life. I didn't want to deal with people, so I packed my gear, filled up my truck, and drove north. I didn't pick a spot with any major trails or campgrounds. I aimed for a remote stretch of forest land about 4 hours from where I lived. I'd found it years earlier on a kayaking trip. There was a narrow, rough dirt road that led to a clearing near a river bend, and I remembered thinking back then that it would be the perfect place to camp if I ever wanted to be completely alone. The drive took most of the morning. After 2 hours on the highway, the road started to get worse. Bumpy back roads with fewer signs, then gravel roads, and eventually the last 8 miles were dirt, narrow, and full of overgrowth. My truck handled it, but I had to take it slow. I only passed one other vehicle the whole way, a beat-up Jeep going the opposite direction, and even that was more than I expected. When I finally reached the spot I remembered, it was even better than I'd hoped. The clearing had overgrown a little, but the grass wasn't too tall, and there were no signs of recent campers. The river curved gently beside the trees, with thick forest pressing in around the edges. There were no picnic tables, no fire rings, no noise. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the river running over rocks. I parked near a small slope and unpacked slowly. I had a 2-man tent, a large backpack with food and supplies, a small hatchet, a basic fishing rod, a cooler with ice, and a small camp stove. I set up the tent closer to the tree line for shade and then gathered wood for a fire. By the time I had everything arranged, it was already late afternoon. The first night was calm. I cooked some canned chili, read from a paperback, and sat near the fire until the stars came out. The sky looked huge and sharp out there, like the stars were closer. I didn't have cell signal, which I expected, and honestly, it was part of the reason I chose that spot. I needed the break. The only sounds were the river, the wind in the trees, and the occasional snapping of branches in the woods, normal stuff. At one point, I heard what I figured was a deer moving through the brush, and I didn't think twice about it. That night, I slept deep. The air was cool, the ground was soft enough with the sleeping pad, and there were no bugs inside the tent. I didn't wake up once. The next morning, I brewed instant coffee over the camp stove and went to the river to try fishing. I didn't catch anything, but that didn't bother me. I sat on a rock by the water for an hour, just listening. The air felt different out there, more real, I guess, like every sound mattered. Eventually, I walked farther upstream, away from camp, just to see what I could find. About a quarter-mile along the riverbank, I found something strange. At first, I thought it was just a pile of debris caught in the trees, maybe driftwood or trash from high water. But as I got closer, I realized it was a tent. A full tent, older looking, dark green, partly collapsed. It was maybe 50 feet back from the river, hidden behind a row of thick bushes. I hadn't seen it the day before. It looked like it had been there for a while. The fabric was sun-faded and dirty. One of the poles was broken, so it sagged on one side. I called out instinctively, then stopped myself. There was no point. If someone was there, they'd already know I was around. If they weren't, yelling wouldn't help. I stood there for a long minute, staring at it. Something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't just the surprise of finding it. It was the way it looked forgotten. No tracks led to or from it. No tarp, no campfire, no gear outside. I stepped closer, slowly, and reached out to touch the flap. Inside was even worse. The tent was mostly empty, but not in a clean way. There was a sleeping bag, flattened and dirty, half-zipped. An old backpack in one corner, the top open with what looked like mold inside. A small, rusted camping stove sat near the door. Everything smelled faintly sour, like mildew and old food. I poked around the bag but didn't take anything out. There was a broken pair of sunglasses, some damp socks, a lighter with no fluid, and a notebook with most of the pages stuck together from moisture. I could see faint handwriting, but I couldn't read it. I backed out of the tent and looked around again. There were no signs of a recent fire, no fresh footprints, no garbage, not even food wrappers or cans. Just the collapsed tent in the middle of nowhere. I stood there another minute trying to decide what to do. Eventually, I just left it. I didn't like the feeling that settled over me. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just abandoned, it was like whoever had stayed there had never planned to leave or hadn't gotten the chance. I walked back to my own campsite more quickly than I meant to. The air felt colder. I kept glancing back toward the trees, half expecting to see someone watching. But there was no one. Back at my site, I tried to shake it off. I made lunch, cleaned up the area, and forced myself to relax by the river again. I didn't go fishing. I just sat and watched the water move. That second night, I couldn't sleep. It started with small noises, not unusual for a forest. Twigs snapping, rustling leaves, the wind shifting, but they felt too close. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against the tent, like a hand or a branch dragging slowly across the fabric. I sat up and listened for over an hour, holding my hatchet. Nothing else happened, and eventually, I must have drifted off. In the morning, there were faint prints near the tent. Not boots, bare feet, just 2, maybe 3 steps in soft dirt near the backside, facing the tent like someone had stood there for a while, watching. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I knew they weren't mine. I had been wearing hiking boots the whole time. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a large raccoon or something, but I knew better. I've camped enough to know animal tracks. These were human. That morning, I packed up fast. I hadn't planned to leave until the next day, but something in my gut told me I shouldn't stay. As I loaded my gear into the truck, I kept looking toward the woods, toward that other tent upstream. I had the keys in the ignition when I heard the noise again. Movement in the brush, maybe 30 feet away. I didn't wait. I started the truck and pulled out, wheels spinning slightly in the dirt as I turned onto the narrow path. Even as I drove, I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. At one point, a figure moved in the trees to my left, just a flicker of motion. I only caught it for a second in the rearview mirror. Could have been anything, or not. The drive back felt longer. My heart didn't slow until I hit the pavement again. I stopped at the first gas station I found, a small place with dusty windows and a faded Coke machine. I didn't say anything to the clerk about what happened. I just got coffee and drove home. I spent the next few days trying to forget about it. I didn't go through my gear. I didn't even unpack everything. But the thought kept coming back to me. That other tent, the rotted sleeping bag, the empty look of it all, and those bare prints near mine. A week later, I went online and searched for missing people in that county. I didn't expect to find anything, but I did. A man named Travis, mid-30s, had gone camping alone 8 months earlier. Never came back. His car had been found parked near a forest road, not far from the area where I'd camped. The article said search teams had looked for 3 days. No sign of him. They assumed he got lost or drowned in the river. His family had posted photos. He looked like an average guy, dark hair, beard, lean build. One of the pictures showed him holding a green tent, the same kind I'd found. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. What would I even say? I didn't touch anything. I hadn't taken anything. I couldn't prove it was his tent. And if it was, what had happened to him? Sometimes I still think about it, about how quiet that place was, about the tracks near my tent, about the feeling I got standing in front of that sagging green nylon, surrounded by trees. I don't camp alone anymore. I've tried a few times, but I always end up turning around before nightfall. I keep remembering that rotten sleeping bag, and the notebook with the stuck-together pages, and how it all looked like someone had meant to stay forever and just disappeared. That part of the forest probably still has that tent. Maybe someone else will find it, or maybe it'll collapse and rot into the ground over time. Either way, I won't go back. not even to see if it's still there. And whoever or whatever stood behind my tent that night hasn't left my memory once. Not once. I had been planning a solo camping trip for a long time. Life had gotten too noisy, too full of things I didn't care about. I felt like I was just watching everything pass me by from inside a glass box. I wasn't sleeping well. I barely ate. I sat in meetings pretending to listen, while my brain wandered somewhere far off into the woods. So I picked a long weekend, filled my backpack with gear, packed 3 days worth of dehydrated food, and drove out to a place I found on an old trail map, an isolated ridgeline deep in the forest, about 12 miles from the nearest road. I parked at a small trailhead that didn't look like it saw much use. The dirt parking lot was uneven and had grass growing through cracks in the ground. There was one faded trail marker nailed to a tree, pointing into thick woods. I locked my truck, put the keys in a hidden pocket in my pack, and started walking. It was late afternoon, and the forest around me was quiet and still. Tall pines stood in rows like sentries, their trunks gray and weathered. I followed the narrow trail uphill, listening to the sound of my boots crunching dried pine needles. I liked that there weren't any people around. I hadn't seen a single car on the gravel road for the last hour before arriving. That was exactly what I wanted, nothing but trees, wind, and time. After about 3 hours of hiking, the trail leveled out. I found a small clearing surrounded by trees and decided to set up camp. It was a decent spot, flat and shaded, with a big rock I could use as a windbreak. I pitched my tent facing east, tied my food bag to a tree branch away from camp, and boiled water for dinner. I ate quickly, washed out the pot, and lay down on my foam pad as dusk settled in. It got cold fast once the sun went down. I pulled my sleeping bag tight around me and listened to the forest noises. Rustling leaves, distant owl calls, the occasional creak of tree branches. I was tired, but not enough to sleep. I stared at the nylon ceiling of my tent and thought about how far away everything felt. People, buildings, noise. That night, I drifted in and out of sleep, waking up several times to roll over, adjust my position, or listen to strange little sounds in the distance. By morning, the sky was clear and pale. I made coffee with instant powder and filtered some fresh water from a nearby stream. I repacked my gear and continued hiking along the trail. The plan was to reach the ridgeline by noon, then spend the rest of the day exploring the high ground and setting up a new camp somewhere with a view. The ridge started with a steep climb. It was hard going, the trail overgrown and choked with fallen branches. I had to duck under limbs and step over rocks that made my knees ache. Sweat soaked through my shirt. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears by the time I reached the top. The ridgeline stretched for about 2 miles, running like a crooked spine through the forest. On one side was a deep valley filled with dense trees. On the other, a steep slope that dropped off into thick underbrush. I followed the spine until I reached a high point with a clear view through the trees. I could see far into the distance, nothing but green hills rolling into the horizon. No towns, no roads, not even the distant buzz of airplanes. It was beautiful, but I felt something strange as I stood there, a kind of awareness, like I was being watched, even though I knew no one was around. I shook it off, probably just nerves from being alone too long. I dropped my pack and took a break, drinking from my water bottle and stretching my legs. Around mid-afternoon, I found a flat patch just off the ridgeline that looked like a good place to camp. The ground was soft and covered in pine needles, and there were no signs of recent animals or weather damage. I set up my tent again, hung the food bag, and spent the rest of the daylight walking a loop around the ridge, trying to get a feel for the area. That's when I found something I hadn't expected. It was about a 1/4 mile from my camp, what looked like an old tarp, shredded and half buried under branches and moss. I pulled it loose and found a small pile of camping gear underneath. Most of it was rotted or broken. A rusted mess kit, a collapsed tent frame, and a moldy sleeping bag. It all looked like it had been there for years. I didn't touch anything else. I stepped back and looked around, but saw no sign of anyone. No footprints, no notes, just the silent remains of a camp someone had left behind. Back at my tent, I kept thinking about that gear. Why would someone leave all that behind? Why didn't they take it with them, even if it was falling apart? Maybe they'd gotten hurt and hiked out in a hurry. Maybe they'd just abandoned it. Still, the way it was buried under sticks and brush made me feel uneasy, like it had been intentionally hidden. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing small sounds outside the tent. A snapping twig, a rustle in the brush. I told myself it was just wind or animals, maybe a deer walking past or a raccoon sniffing around. Still, I lay in the dark for hours, my eyes open, waiting for a sound that never came. At some point, I drifted off. When I woke up, it was barely light out. The air felt heavy, like something had shifted during the night. I crawled out of the tent, stretched, and walked to the tree where I'd hung my food bag. It was gone. The branch was still there. The rope was still tied, but the bag was missing. I looked around, thinking it might have fallen, but I didn't see it on the ground. I searched a wider circle, checking nearby bushes and rocks. Nothing, not even scraps of fabric. The whole bag was just gone. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. If an animal had taken it, I should have found bits of it somewhere. Pieces of the plastic bag, food wrappers, something. But there was nothing, just the empty tree. I packed up fast. I hadn't planned to hike out yet, but I wasn't comfortable staying there another night. Something felt wrong. Not just the missing food, but the silence. The air was still and quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. I started back along the ridgeline, hoping to get back to the original trailhead by sunset. The hike was harder than I expected. I felt like I was being watched the whole time. I kept stopping to look behind me, convinced I'd hear footsteps, but there was never anyone there. The woods were completely still. I got back to the first clearing I'd camped at around mid-afternoon. I thought about staying there for the night, but I didn't like the idea of sleeping again. Not with the food bag still missing, and that old camp gear still in my mind. I decided to push through and hike all the way out, even if it meant walking after dark. As the sun dropped, the trail seemed to twist in ways I didn't remember. I followed the markers carefully, but I kept getting the feeling I'd walked in circles. Once I passed the same broken log twice in under an hour. That shouldn't have been possible. I stopped, sat on a rock, and tried to get my bearings. That's when I noticed the silence again. No birds, no wind, nothing. It was like the forest had stopped breathing. I stood up quickly and kept moving, walking faster now, heart racing. My pack felt heavier with every step. The shadows got longer, darker. The trail narrowed. Branches seemed to claw at my arms and legs. I tripped twice, nearly falling down a slope. At some point, I noticed something on the ground. Boot prints, faint but fresh. Not mine. They pointed the same direction I was heading. I froze. Someone else had been here recently. I crouched down and looked closer. Deep impressions made by someone heavier than me. The pattern was unfamiliar. I kept walking, but more carefully. I didn't want to run into whoever made those prints. I didn't even know if they were still here, but I didn't want to find out. It got darker. I pulled out my headlamp and kept it dim to avoid being seen. My legs burned. My mouth was dry. I was almost out of water. I hadn't eaten since morning. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone moving between the trees. Then I heard it, a soft, distant sound. Not an animal, not a branch. Footsteps, slow, measured. Not right behind me, but close enough that I could feel them. I stopped breathing. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned off the headlamp and crouched low behind a boulder. I stayed there for almost 20 minutes, not moving. Not blinking, just listening. The footsteps stopped. After a long time, I moved again. Slow, careful. I stayed low, cutting off the trail and slipping through brush to avoid being seen. I didn't know where I was anymore, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I kept moving downhill, hoping I'd hit a road or a stream or anything that could lead me back to the trailhead. My hands were scratched. My legs were shaking. I was cold and hungry, but I didn't stop. It was almost midnight when I saw the first sign of a road. a patch of gravel through the trees. I stumbled toward it, crashing through branches, not caring how much noise I made. My truck was there, dark and still. I dug out the keys and unlocked the door with shaking hands. I drove the entire way home without stopping. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't eat. I had always liked doing things alone. I don't know why. I guess it made me feel like I had more control. No waiting on other people, no drama, no distractions. I could focus on the experience, the little things, the quiet. So when I planned a solo camping trip deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains last October, it didn't feel strange to me. It felt like exactly what I needed. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress from work. Things weren't going well at the office, and I needed to get out of the city, disconnect from everything. I wanted to clear my head, reset. Nature had always helped me do that. So I took a few days off, packed my gear, filled my cooler with enough food and water for 5 days, and drove 6 hours into the mountains. I parked at a remote trailhead off a small gravel forest road that barely saw any traffic. I chose that area on purpose because it wasn't a popular hiking or camping destination. I didn't want other people around. I just wanted to be completely alone for a while. The plan was to hike about 8 miles into the backcountry and set up camp in a flat, quiet clearing I had found years earlier when I was hiking with a friend. The place wasn't marked on any maps. It didn't have a name or trail leading to it. You had to bushwhack for a mile or so off the main path to get there. That's what made it perfect. Nobody would wander through by accident. It felt like my own hidden corner of the world. The hike in was uneventful. The weather was mild, skies clear. I carried a heavy pack, but I took my time. I passed nobody on the way in. The forest was quiet except for the sound of wind through the leaves and the occasional birdsong. I followed the trail until it curved away from the ridge, then veered off into the underbrush. Using a compass and landmarks, I remembered to navigate the unmarked way to the clearing. When I reached it, the place looked just as I remembered it. A wide, flat patch of ground surrounded by tall trees, soft with pine needles, and a gentle slope leading down to a small stream not far away. I set up my tent in the same spot I had used before, close enough to hear the water at night. I built a small fire ring from stones, cleared the area of loose twigs, and unpacked my gear. The first day passed peacefully. I cooked a simple meal on my small camp stove, watched the sun dip behind the ridge, and listened to the forest come alive at night. It was colder than I expected once the sun went down, but I had a good sleeping bag. I crawled into my tent early, read a paperback by headlamp for an hour, then fell asleep. The first night was normal. A few distant animal sounds, maybe a fox or a coyote, but nothing alarming. The second day I spent exploring the area, hiking up a nearby hill for a better view, filtering water from the stream, and just sitting in the stillness. I didn't see or hear anyone, not a single airplane, not even a squirrel for a while. It was exactly what I had wanted. But things started to feel strange that evening. It was small at first, just a feeling, like the woods were too quiet. I know that sounds vague, but if you've spent enough time in the forest, you know what normal sounds like. The chatter of birds, the rustle of leaves, insects buzzing. It had all stopped for some reason, like everything was holding its breath. I noticed it while I was cooking dinner. I had a pot of rice and beans going, and I paused to take a sip from my water bottle. That's when I realized I hadn't heard anything in over 20 minutes. Not a single bird, just wind. It was eerie. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. The sun was setting, and the trees were casting long shadows. I told myself it was probably just normal forest behavior. Sometimes animals go quiet at dusk. Still, I felt uneasy for the first time on the trip. I sat closer to the fire than I normally would, ate quickly, and cleaned up my cookware before it got fully dark. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard something. It wasn't an animal sound. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I had just started to drift off when I heard the crunch of leaves. Slow, careful steps. My eyes opened immediately. My tent was zipped shut, but the moonlight was bright enough that I could see shadows moving faintly through the fabric. The steps were maybe 30 feet away. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. No more footsteps. No breathing. No noise at all. Just silence again. I stayed awake for over an hour, waiting. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I told myself it had to be a deer or a black bear passing through. I had hung my food in a bear bag well away from camp, so I knew it wouldn't be lured by smell. I kept my headlamp within reach and the small hatchet I carried for firewood beside me. I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m., still feeling uneasy. The next morning, I looked around the campsite. I expected to see prints in the soft dirt or signs that an animal had wandered nearby, but there was nothing. The ground looked untouched. That only made me feel worse. Around midday, I hiked down the ridge a bit to see if I could spot anything. Maybe a bear's tracks, maybe signs of someone hiking nearby, but I found nothing. The woods were thick in every direction. I was miles from the nearest trail. When I came back, I noticed something strange. There was a stick propped against a tree near my tent. A long, straight stick I hadn't noticed before. It was balanced carefully between a rock and the bark, like someone had placed it there deliberately. I knew I hadn't done it. I remembered clearing the area the day before, and that stick wasn't there. It wasn't broken or fallen naturally. It looked like someone had placed it to mark something, or maybe as a message. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't want to believe someone else was out there, but I had to admit it was possible. There were no signs of other camps, no fire rings, no footprints, but maybe someone was passing through. Maybe a hunter or a squatter. Maybe someone who didn't want company. I told myself it could have been nothing, just a stick that happened to fall in a weird way. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I didn't cook. I ate a protein bar cold and sat with my headlamp off, trying not to make any light. I listened. For a long time, there was nothing. But just before midnight, I heard footsteps again. This time, they were slower, more careful. They circled the area. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, eyes wide, heart pounding. The steps would come close, then fade into the trees, then come back from a different direction, like someone was walking a slow circle around the camp. Then, something moved just outside the tent. A shape, a shadow passed across the wall of fabric. Tall, upright, human-shaped. I didn't breathe. The figure paused. I could see it standing there, just 10 feet away. Then it walked off, slow and silent. I didn't hear it leave. It just stopped being there. That was the worst night of my life. I didn't sleep at all. When the sky finally turned gray and birds started singing again, I unzipped the tent and looked around. There was nothing. No prints, no objects left behind. But the stick by the tree was gone. I packed up immediately. My plan had been to stay 5 days, but I wasn't going to wait around and see what that person, or whatever that was, wanted. I had a GPS and knew the way out, but I decided to take a different path back. One that looped wide through a lower valley and connected to the forest road several miles from my car. It would take longer, but I didn't want to risk running into whoever had come to my camp. I felt watched the entire time I packed. The hike back was miserable. I kept hearing things behind me. Branches snapping, movement in the underbrush, but whenever I stopped and turned, there was nothing. It wasn't wind. The air was still that morning. The feeling of being followed never went away. About 3 miles from where I had planned to reconnect with the road, I found something that stopped me cold. A pile of small bones laid out neatly on a flat rock beside the trail. Clean, white, arranged in a spiral pattern. Not natural, not animal behavior. That's when I started moving fast. I reached the forest road by late afternoon and kept walking until I got to my car, lungs burning, legs aching. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't even drink water. I just wanted to get out of there. When I finally saw my car parked under the trees, I felt a huge wave of relief. But when I got to it, something chilled me all over again. There were fresh fingerprints on the driver's window, smudges in the dust, large, oily handprints that hadn't been there before. I checked all the doors locked. The windows were intact. Nothing inside was missing or broken, but someone had touched my car. I started the engine and drove out of there as fast as the forest road would let me. Back in town, I didn't tell anyone. What was I going to say? That I thought someone had followed me in the woods and watched me at night? That they left me bone spirals and finger marks? I didn't have proof. I barely had my own sanity, but I haven't gone camping since. I sold most of my gear. The tent, the sleeping bag, the stove, all of it. I kept the hatchet, though, just in case. I don't know what was really out there. I don't know if it was a hermit, a hunter, or someone living wild in those. It started as something simple. I just wanted to be alone for a few days. Work had been exhausting. My head was constantly spinning, and everything felt loud. Phones, emails, people. I had this urge to get away from it all. I didn't want to talk to anyone or hear traffic or look at screens. I just wanted silence. Trees, wind, maybe some rain. I had done a few camping trips before, mostly short and close to town. But this time I wanted something deeper, farther, somewhere I knew I wouldn't run into anyone. I found this place while scanning through some old blogs that hadn't been updated in years. It wasn't an official campground. It wasn't on Google Maps unless you zoomed way in and squinted at the forest lines. A guy had posted a GPS coordinate from his 2013 trip, called it the perfect solo spot. It was about 12 miles into a dense national forest, off a dirt road that didn't even have a name. The more I looked at it, the better it sounded. That was all I needed. I packed my gear, printed out some maps just in case my GPS failed, and drove out early that Saturday morning. The drive took hours. Eventually, I left the pavement behind and started creeping down an old gravel road lined with thick pine and birch. The road wasn't completely abandoned. It looked like hunters or forest rangers had been through at some point, but it was overgrown. I had to drive around branches, and a few times I stopped to kick rocks and limbs out of the way. I parked the car at a pull-off, checked my bag, locked everything, and started walking. I made sure I was carrying enough water, had my knife, a compass, and my backup battery for my GPS. I was careful. I wasn't trying to die out there. I just wanted peace. The hike was steep for the first 2 miles. Then it flattened out into rolling terrain that looked like it hadn't seen a person in years. No beer cans, no old fire pits, no boot tracks. Just untouched forest. The air was still, and it had that earthy smell of old leaves, moss, and tree bark. I hiked for another 2 hours, past a small stream, and eventually found the clearing the blogger had described. It was perfect, wide open, covered in soft pine needles, trees all around, no signs of people anywhere. I set up my tent near the tree line for some shade, unrolled my sleeping pad, and boiled some water for lunch. Felt perfect. That first day passed slow and peaceful. I went for a short walk in the late afternoon, maybe 2 miles out and back, and saw nothing but trees, animal tracks, and one deer. At night, I laid in the tent, listening to the wind in the branches. I slept well. The next day, I woke early and decided to hike farther into the woods, beyond the stream I'd crossed before. I didn't have a specific goal. I just wanted to see how deep I could go before turning back. I brought a day pack, some water, and a couple energy bars, and marked my trail with small rock piles and sticks so I wouldn't get turned around. I walked for what felt like hours, and the farther I went, the quieter it got. Even the birds thinned out. The forest was dense, but not impassable. I kept going. Around early afternoon, I saw something strange in the distance through a break in the trees. Something gray and square. It looked out of place. At first I thought it was a boulder, but as I got closer, I realized it was man-made. A shack. It sat about 30 yards off a narrow game trail, hidden behind a thick stand of pine. The wood was weathered, the metal roof rusted, but it wasn't falling apart. It was standing solid, like someone had built it with care. There was a small window covered in mesh. No glass. The door was shut, and it looked like someone had used a tarp to reinforce the side facing the wind. I stood behind a tree for a minute, just watching. There were no signs of life, no smoke, no sound, no vehicle tracks, but something about it felt off. Out here, this deep in the woods, there shouldn't have been anything. No cabins, no structures, nothing. I checked my map again. There were no markings, and I knew this part of the forest wasn't zoned for camping, let alone building anything. I walked around the shack slowly, staying quiet. I don't know why, just instinct. The backside had a stack of chopped wood and what looked like a rain catch system using old gutter pieces. Someone had put time into it. This wasn't abandoned. Still, I couldn't stop myself. I moved to the door, turned the handle, and pushed it open. The smell hit me first. Damp wood, something sour like sweat, and a strange metallic tang. The inside was dim. The single window didn't let in much light, and the roof hung low. There was a cot along one wall, a camping stove on a plastic crate, and shelves lined with cans, beans, corn, Spam, soups. Someone had been living here, maybe still was. Coat hung on a nail. A hatchet sat near the door. A pack leaned against the wall, half unzipped. I froze. The place wasn't just occupied. It was active. It looked like whoever lived here had just stepped out. There were still water droplets in a cup on the crate. I backed out quickly and shut the door without making a sound. Every hair on my neck stood up. I scanned the trees around me. Nothing moved. No sound. But my gut was screaming that I needed to go. I started walking fast, not running, just enough to get distance between me and that shack. I stopped every few hundred feet and listened. Still nothing. I made my way back to camp, constantly checking behind me. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew I'd been there. Someone was watching. That night I couldn't sleep. I laid in the tent with my knife in my hand, flinching at every noise. Branches snapped in the dark. Something moved out there, but I couldn't tell how close. I stayed silent and still until morning. To first light, I packed everything. I didn't make coffee. I didn't eat. I just wanted out. The hike back felt twice as long. I kept hearing things. Sticks snapping, rustling leaves. But every time I turned, there was nothing. When I reached my car, I tossed my pack inside and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway hours later. I thought that was it. I thought I was done. But when I got home, things got worse. About a week later, I found something strange under my windshield wiper. It was a strip of bark with a single word burned into it. Saw. No note. No handwriting. Just that. I looked around the parking lot but saw no one. I lived in a small apartment complex in a quiet area. No cameras. No one saw anything. I brought it inside, set it on the table, and stared at it for hours. Was it a joke? A warning? I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I found a shack in the woods and someone left me a piece of bark? A few nights later, I noticed someone had moved one of my backyard chairs. I never sat out there. It had been pushed back against the fence, facing my kitchen window. I hadn't done that. No one should have had access to my yard. That night, I barely slept. I started checking every lock twice, pulling curtains shut, keeping lights on in the hallway. My heart raced at every bump or creak. I couldn't focus at work. I was always looking over my shoulder. I started sleeping with a hammer under my bed. Not even a knife anymore. I needed something heavier. I knew something was wrong. I knew someone had followed me. Whoever lived in that shack, they must have seen me. Or maybe they had cameras. Or maybe they were already watching me before I even found the place. I didn't know. A month later, it all came to a head. I came home from work, and the front door was cracked open. Nothing looked broken. The frame was intact. The lock wasn't forced. It was just open. I stood on the porch for a long time, just listening. Eventually, I stepped inside, holding my phone like a weapon. I checked every room, slowly, breathing hard. No one was there, but something was different, something small. On my coffee table sat one of the cans from the shack. Spam. Same brand, same style, same dent in the corner. That's when I left. I didn't pack. I didn't clean. I grabbed my car keys and went straight to a friend's place across town. I didn't explain everything. I just told them someone had broken in and I felt unsafe. I called the police, filed a report, and told them everything I could. They did a walkthrough but said there were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, and not much they could do without more evidence. I knew they didn't believe me. They probably thought I left the door open myself. But I knew the truth. I'd locked that door, Over the next few weeks, I stayed in hotels, then finally moved to another city altogether. I broke the lease, paid the fee, and left everything behind. I needed distance. I needed to be somewhere bigger, somewhere safer. I moved into a place with security, cameras, and neighbors on all sides. I told myself I was safe now, that it was over. It's been nearly a year since it all happened. I haven't gone camping since. I haven't been in the woods. Not once. I barely even go near parks anymore. The trees feel different now. They feel I had been planning the trip for weeks. I was tired of the noise, the traffic, the constant hum of machines and people talking. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in a noisy part of town. The walls were thin, and even at night, there was no peace. I had saved up my vacation days and decided I'd take a long weekend for myself. No hotels, no restaurants, just me, a tent, and the woods. I picked a spot a few hours from home, in an area that didn't have a lot of foot traffic. It was a patch of forest a bit south of the national park boundary, which meant fewer hikers, fewer tourists, and fewer rules. I liked that. It was just public land, free to camp on if you could find your way into it. A lot of the area was dry pine forest and old scrub, with deep ravines and winding, narrow creek beds that only filled up when it rained hard. This place had that brittle, sun-bleached feeling during the day, and then a cold emptiness at night. I had camped in spots like that before. They always seemed a little too quiet, but that's what I was looking for. I parked my car at the end of an old dirt road, locked everything up, and double-checked the gear in my pack. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, some freeze-dried meals, flashlight, knife, bear spray, extra water, and my GPS. I also carried a paper map and compass just in case. I didn't plan to go far off the trail, but I always liked being prepared. I had been on dozens of solo trips before this, and I knew what I was doing. I followed an overgrown trail down into a narrow valley. It was quiet, except for the occasional crunch of dead branches under my boots. The trail twisted through dry pines and thick brush, then dropped down again, steeply this time, toward what used to be a creek bed. I picked my way over old river rocks, bleached gray by the sun. The land flattened out a little and formed a sort of bowl with low hills all around. The trees thinned here, and the dry bed snaked down the middle, flanked by scattered thorn bushes and little tufts of grass. There were no other footprints. I found a flat spot a little ways up from the dry creek, shaded by a few bent pines and shielded from the wind. It was a good campsite, quiet, remote, and clean. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping pad and bag, and sat for a while listening to the soft hum of bugs. The sun had dipped low behind the hills. Everything was painted in long shadows and warm light. It was peaceful. That first night was uneventful. I heated up a bag of chili on my stove, watched the stars come out, then zipped up inside my tent around 9 o'clock. I woke up a few times from the cold, but there were no strange noises, no animals poking around, nothing to worry about. I felt relaxed. It was exactly the kind of break I needed. The next day, I hiked a few miles along the bed, not really going anywhere in particular. The ground here was cracked and dry, and the creek bed twisted like a scar through the earth. I didn't see any sign of other campers or hikers, just animal tracks. Mostly rabbits, coyotes, and something that might have been deer, though it was hard to tell in the dust. I came across an old metal barrel halfway buried in sand, rusted through and empty. There were scraps of torn tarp tangled in nearby branches and a half-melted plastic jug beside a burned-out fire pit. Someone had camped there a long time ago, but it had been years. That evening, I cooked another meal, sat quietly, then went to bed a little after dark. I kept my knife close, like I always did. It wasn't fear exactly. It was just a habit I had, one of those little things that made me feel better when I was out alone. I fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through dry pine needles. I woke up suddenly sometime deep into the night. I didn't know why at first. There wasn't a sound, just that feeling in my chest, the kind that pulls you out of sleep with a tightness in your gut. I sat up slowly, unzipped the tent, and looked out. The moon was out, casting pale light over the trees. Everything looked normal. I listened hard, but heard nothing, not even the wind. Eventually, I lay back down and told myself I was being paranoid. Sometimes your brain plays tricks when you're alone. I didn't sleep well after that, though. The third day was hotter. The sun came up bright and sharp through the trees. I filtered more water and did a little reading, then took a nap in the shade. But something kept nagging me. It wasn't fear, not yet, just a vague tension. I told myself I was just unused to the silence. There was no cell signal out here, and I hadn't seen a soul since I'd parked the car. That should have felt peaceful. But instead, it felt like I was being watched. That evening, just before sunset, I noticed something weird. I was sitting near the tent when I looked up and saw that a small pile of stones had been stacked along the edge of the creek bed, maybe 30 feet from where I was camped. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. It was a small stack, 5 flat stones balanced neatly, too neatly. At first, I thought maybe I had done it without thinking, or that it was just coincidence the way rocks fall. But it was too perfect. I walked over to look. The stones weren't from that spot. They didn't match the others on the ground. Someone had carried them. I stood there for a long time, then walked the edge of the brush to see if there were any signs. Boot prints, broken branches, anything. But the ground was dry and hard. Nothing showed. I circled the camp once, slowly, checking everything. Nothing seemed touched, nothing was missing. But I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound put me on edge. The snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves. I turned my light on once or twice and scanned the area, but saw nothing. Still, I kept the knife in my hand, under the sleeping bag, and I didn't close my eyes for long. Something felt wrong. Not in a loud, obvious way. More like a pressure in the air, something off. The next morning, I found another rock stack. This one was closer, only about 15 feet from the tent, behind a small bush. Same shape, same height, 5 flat stones carefully balanced. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a long time. The sun was barely over the ridge. The light was gold and sharp. Everything else was normal, the tent, the gear, the trees. But that little tower sat there like a silent message, and I had no idea what it meant. I packed up everything within an hour. I didn't eat. I didn't make coffee. I took down the tent, stuffed it into my pack, and started walking. I didn't follow the trail back the way I came. I cut cross-country, heading due north using my compass, hoping to hit the road or at least the ridgeline I'd seen the first day. The forest grew denser and rougher. I had to stop often to check the map and my bearings. My pack felt heavier than it should have. The heat was worse that day, and I was sweating hard. By early afternoon, I started noticing things, little things, like broken branches that didn't look natural. They weren't just snapped, they were twisted. Not all of them, just here and there. Then I found a bit of cordage tied around a tree branch. Frayed yellow nylon, the kind you'd use on a tent. It looked old, weathered, and dirty. Maybe left behind years ago. But still, it unsettled me. I pushed on. I figured I was maybe 3 miles from where I had camped, and maybe another mile or so to where the dirt road should be. The woods were thicker now, tighter, darker. The kind of growth where sound doesn't carry well. That was the worst part. I couldn't hear anything. No wind, no birds, just my own footsteps and the scrape of my pack. Then I found the third rock pile. This time, it wasn't near a creek or clearing. It was right in the middle of the forest trail I was following. It was fresh. I could tell because the bottom stone was still damp on one side, where it had been lying flat on the ground. Someone had been here, maybe hours ago, maybe less. I froze. Every part of me screamed to turn around. But where would I go? I wasn't even sure how far I was from the road. I looked around slowly. Every shadow looked like it might move. Every tree could have hidden someone. I didn't see anything, but that didn't mean no one was there. I kept walking. I tried not to look back too often. I tried to move faster, but not run. I knew if I panicked and got lost, I might never get out. I started counting my steps, trying to keep my mind busy. But after a while, I noticed something else. A strange smell. It was faint, but it grew stronger the deeper I went. It smelled like something rotten. Not strong like a fresh kill, more like decay that had baked in the sun too long. It came and went, as if I was catching it on the breeze. But it was there. The trees thinned out suddenly, and I broke into a clearing. The sun was blinding. I stopped to drink water, then froze again. At the far end of the clearing, half buried in brush, was an old tent. Faded blue, torn along one side. It had collapsed in on itself. I stood there a long time, staring at it. Part of me wanted to walk over, see what was inside, but a stronger part of me wanted to get as far from it as I could. I skirted the edge of the clearing and kept going. I planned a solo camping trip at the start of June, just before the big summer crowds took over the national parks. I had been working long weeks, glued to a computer screen every day, barely sleeping, eating whatever was fastest, and sitting indoors even on weekends. I needed to reset. I chose a quiet spot I found online, a remote forest area in the northern part of the state, not far from a large reservoir. There were no official campgrounds in the place I picked, but there were trail maps and notes from other hikers saying there were flat clearings near the river where I could pitch a tent. I didn't care about facilities. I just wanted silence, trees, and time away from people. I wanted to be unreachable. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, headlamp, compass, emergency whistle, knife, bear spray, extra socks, water filter, and a satellite communicator for emergencies. I wasn't reckless, just tired of constant noise and screens. I checked the weather forecast. Clear skies, mild nights, nothing to worry about. I filled up my gas tank and drove 5.5 hours to the edge of the national forest. From there, a dirt road twisted through thick trees for another 40 minutes until I reached a small parking pull-off by the edge of a trailhead. I saw no other cars. That was perfect. I left a note with my roommate and sent a pin drop of my planned route. I even told them the day I planned to hike out. I thought I had done everything right. The hike started easy. A gentle incline, well-worn trail, cool morning air. The trees were tall and thick, pine and spruce mostly, with patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy and lighting up the ground in golden stripes. Birds were loud and active, flitting through the branches, and squirrels were darting across the trail every so often. I followed the route I mapped out, using an offline GPS on my phone and paper maps for backup. The trail split a few times, but I kept checking both maps and the compass. I felt confident. By early afternoon, I reached the river. It wasn't wide, maybe 15 feet across, but the current was steady, the water clear and fast. I found a clearing a few hundred feet upstream. There were signs someone else had camped there before. Flattened grass, a ring of stones where a fire had once been, and some scraps of paracord tied between two trees. But no trash. Felt peaceful. I unpacked, set up my tent, and filtered some water from the river. I spent the evening sitting on a flat rock near the riverbank, watching the light change through the trees, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. That first night was uneventful. I heard the usual night sounds. Wind in the trees, insects buzzing, maybe a coyote far off. I woke up once or twice to adjust my sleeping bag, but nothing unusual. I didn't even use earplugs because I liked hearing the sounds around me. It made me feel connected. The next morning, I boiled water for instant coffee, then went for a short walk along the river. I left my camp gear where it was and carried only my knife and some snacks. I wasn't planning to go far, just follow the river a bit, explore upstream. The terrain was manageable. Some thick underbrush but not too dense, and a few rocky spots where I had to step carefully. After maybe a half hour, I found a narrow game trail branching away from the river and going deeper into the trees. I thought it might lead to a higher viewpoint, maybe a ridge or a meadow, so I followed it. The trail twisted and climbed, and I kept going, thinking I'd just go a bit further, then turn back. I didn't mark the entrance since I was following a visible path, and I kept looking back to remember how it looked. But the trail kept getting fainter the higher I went. Eventually, the dirt path became just patches of flattened grass and occasional scuffs in the soil. It was clear animals used it more than humans, but I kept going. I didn't realize how far I'd gone until I checked the time. Almost 2 hours had passed. I decided to turn around, but the trail behind me didn't look the same. The grass all looked flattened. The woods felt denser. The sun had moved and the light came from a different angle. I turned around twice to make sure I was facing the right way. My compass needle pointed north, and I knew my camp was roughly south-southwest. I started walking that way, but something didn't feel right. After 15 minutes, I still hadn't seen the river. There was no sound of water. I thought maybe I veered off, so I adjusted my course slightly. I kept going, pushing through some thicker shrubs, stepping over fallen logs. The ground was uneven now, and it sloped downward, but not toward the river. An hour passed. I stopped and listened. Still no sound of water. No distant rustling of wind on a river. No sparkle through the trees. Just more woods. I felt a low tightness in my chest. I wasn't panicking yet, but I didn't like how far I'd gone without seeing anything familiar. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. The GPS map still showed the blue dot, but the satellite image was blurry and I couldn't make out the trails. The compass still worked, but the terrain wasn't matching what I remembered. I started to wonder if I'd crossed over some unseen ridge or turned slightly the wrong way and kept reinforcing the mistake with every step. I looked behind me again. The way back didn't look any clearer. I told myself to stay calm. I had snacks, water, and daylight. I looked for higher ground, thinking I could climb up and get a better view. I found a hill and pushed up through the trees. At the top, I saw more trees. Nothing but endless green, layered in every direction. No break, no river, no clearing, just forest. I decided to keep heading south. That had to be right. But the further I walked, the more I started noticing signs that no one had been out there in a long time. No cut branches, no footprints, no broken twigs. The ground was soft and layered with pine needles. Every so often, I'd see animal prints, deer mostly, sometimes something bigger. Then I saw the tree. It was a pine with deep claw marks down one side. Not fresh, but not completely old either. The bark was scratched down in 3 long lines, low near the base. I stepped back, looking around. I didn't see any tracks nearby, but I knew enough about the outdoors to understand what that meant. Bears used trees to mark territory. I took out my bear spray and kept it in my hand. I kept walking, moving steadily downhill now, which I thought was good. It might lead toward the river. But after another half hour, the slope turned into a shallow ravine, and I found myself walking along a dry creek bed. The rocks were loose and slippery. I stumbled twice. I was sweating hard now. My shirt stuck to my back. My water was almost gone. I stopped again, took a breath, and realized how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just the low hum of insects and the crunch of my boots. I don't know why it hit me then, but I had the first real thought of danger. If I slipped, twisted an ankle, or fell, no one would hear me. I was already overdue to return to camp. I knew that. I tried calling out once, just to see if anyone was nearby. My voice sounded strange in the silence. It vanished into the trees with no echo. That's when I really started feeling it. Not panic exactly, but a growing pressure, like something squeezing down on my chest. I kept walking, following the dry creek bed, hoping it would lead me to water, which might lead me back to the river. But it didn't. After another hour, the ravine opened into a broad, flat area filled with thorny brush and tangled undergrowth. I had to fight through it, arms scratched, legs getting tired. My bottle was empty now. I tried not to drink too fast earlier, but I didn't ration it either. I stopped and crouched in the shade of a tree, trying to calm down. That's when I saw the shape in the brush ahead of me. I froze. It was dark, half covered in vines and sticks. For a second, I thought it was an animal. But when I got closer, I realized it was a backpack. Faded, torn, half rotted. Someone had been here before. I stepped around it, heart thumping, and looked for more. I found part of a boot, then a tattered piece of tarp, then a shredded sleeping bag. It all looked old, weathered, sun-bleached, moldy. I couldn't tell how long it had been there, but I knew it wasn't recent. There was no sign of the person. No bones, no ID, nothing personal I could see. Just gear, left to rot. That's when I started to feel real fear. not just of being lost, but of being forgotten. Whoever had been here before, they never made it out. No one had found them. That's how easy it was. I left the clearing, shaking. I didn't touch anything. I moved faster now, not caring as much about noise. I kept going downhill until the trees started to thin and I saw a strip of sunlight ahead that looked more open. When I reached it, I found a narrow gravel road, just wide enough for one car. It wasn't on any of my maps. I had no idea where it led, but I knew I had to follow it. I walked for almost 2 more hours. My legs ached. I hadn't eaten since morning. My mouth was dry. My tongue felt like sandpaper. Then, just as the sun was starting to dip low behind the trees, I don't know what really made me decide to go camping out there alone. Maybe it was the silence I'd been missing in my life, the stillness that you don't get in the city. I'd been working a desk job for years, long hours, short weekends, traffic, screen time. My brain was fogged up. I needed a break, not just a weekend away, but something with more distance, more space between me and the noise. I remembered hearing about an abandoned limestone quarry out near some state forest land. It had been closed down years ago. There weren't any gates, no signs telling people to stay out, just a bunch of faded, no trespassing signs nailed into trees that had grown crooked with time. Some guy I used to work with mentioned camping out near it once, way back, and said it was quiet, almost too quiet. That stuck with me. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking to feel far from everything. I loaded my old 4Runner with gear, tent, water, freeze-dried food packs, sleeping bag, small propane stove, battery lamp, knife, and a hiking pack. I even brought an old map and a compass in case I lost GPS. I didn't expect any trouble, but I packed a small first aid kit, just to be safe. I wasn't in great shape, but I could still hike for a few miles without a problem. I drove out early on a Thursday morning, hoping that getting there midweek meant I'd avoid any other campers. Not that I expected to see anyone. The last half hour of the drive was all dirt road, narrow, full of potholes and mud from recent rain. Trees leaned close over the road, branches tapping the roof now and then. There were no trail markers, just faint tire tracks from old trucks or ATVs. I followed those, guessing they'd lead to the quarry. Eventually, I reached a clearing with a thin dirt trail that looked like it went deeper into the woods. I parked there, got out and stretched. It was quiet, just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I couldn't even hear any birds. That should have been strange, but I was tired of everything else in my life being loud. I slung on my pack and started walking. The trail wasn't maintained, but you could tell it had been used. Pressed down grass, broken branches, some boot prints that weren't too old. I followed it for about 40 minutes before the trees started to thin out and the ground got rockier. I could smell limestone before I saw it. There it was, the old quarry. It was wide open, almost a huge bowl cut into the earth, surrounded by steep, jagged ledges. The rock face was pale, crumbling in places. There were small trails running along the edge and a few broken down wooden structures, maybe old tool sheds or lookout posts. The water at the bottom was a sick green color, stagnant. It didn't look safe, but I wasn't planning to swim. The whole place felt still, like time had stopped and left it behind. I found a flat spot about 50 yards from the edge of the quarry, tucked back under a few trees. I cleared away some rocks and branches and pitched my tent. It was mid-afternoon, and the light was already getting soft. The trees here were tall and thick, casting long shadows. I laid out my sleeping bag, boiled some water, and ate one of the meal packs, chicken and rice. Tasted like cardboard, but I wasn't out here for the food. As night came down, the wind died. The air felt heavy. There were no crickets, no owls, nothing. I turned off my lamp early and lay in my tent, staring at the ceiling. The quiet was deep, unnatural. I told myself it was just the location, the time of year, maybe even my own expectations messing with me. But I had trouble falling asleep. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. No sound, just a feeling. I couldn't explain it, like my brain had been tapped on the shoulder. I lay still, listening. There was a sound, very faint, like rock scraping against rock. Then silence again. I waited, heart pounding, straining my ears. Nothing. I stayed awake for a long time after that, staring at the walls of the tent, every little rustle outside making my muscles tense. But eventually, I must have drifted off. In the morning, the light seemed colder than it should have been. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Everything looked untouched, but something felt off. I looked around my campsite, checking to make sure nothing had been disturbed. My bag was where I left it. My stove. The trash bag I tied to a tree branch still hung there, untouched by animals. I wandered toward the quarry edge with my coffee mug. The surface of the water was perfectly still. No wind, no ripples, just flat green. I sat on a rock and sipped the coffee, trying to relax. Maybe I just wasn't used to this level of quiet. That had to be it. Later, I took a walk along the rim of the quarry. The terrain was uneven, and in some places, the ledge came close to crumbling. I found what looked like a steep, switchback trail that went down toward the bottom. I followed it halfway, but the smell of the stagnant water grew stronger, and I turned back. There were signs of past campers, ashes from old fire pits, rusted cans, a half-rotted folding chair. I found a small trail branching off from the main area. It led into a dense part of the forest. I walked for a bit, maybe 20 minutes, and found a makeshift lean-to built from branches and a blue tarp that had mostly rotted away. It didn't look recent, but it wasn't ancient either. Nearby were some plastic wrappers, an old knife handle, a cracked thermos. Something about it made me uncomfortable. It wasn't just the sight of abandoned gear. It felt like someone had been here too long, like they hadn't meant to stay but got stuck. I backed away slowly and followed the trail back to camp. That night, the unease grew. I built a small fire, though I hadn't planned to. The light helped. I kept it going until past midnight. I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lamp inside the tent either. I lay awake again, eyes open, heart waiting. At around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. That scraping sound. Closer this time. Sharp. Deliberate. Not a tree creaking, not an animal moving. Rock on rock. I sat up, holding my breath. Then it stopped. I didn't move for over an hour. I didn't sleep again. When morning came, I was exhausted. I stepped outside and found something that made my chest go cold. A long scratch in the rock about 10 feet from my tent. A thin, curved groove maybe 3 feet long. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I packed my bag that morning, but I didn't leave. I told myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd scratched it myself when clearing the area. I walked the perimeter, tried to talk myself down, but the unease was heavy now. It clung to everything. That afternoon, I went back toward the lean-to. I don't know why. Something pulled me. I brought my knife, even though I wasn't sure what I'd do with it. When I got there, I saw fresh footprints. Not mine. Wider, heavier, leading away into the woods. I followed them, slowly, carefully. They moved off-trail through thick brush, down a narrow slope. I crouched and followed, heart in my throat. Then I saw it. Clearing. A small pit dug out in the middle. Bones. Dozens of small bones. Scattered, broken, piled. Some looked like animal bones, rabbits, squirrels, but not all of them. A torn boot lay half-buried nearby, the kind you'd buy at a sporting goods store. I backed away, step by step. My ears were ringing. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting something, someone, to be there, but no one was. I walked fast, then ran, back to my camp. My mouth was dry, my lungs burning. I stuffed everything into my pack. I didn't care how badly it was packed. I needed to leave. Now, as I turned to go, I saw another mark on the same rock near my tent. Another deep scratch parallel to the first. Fresh. I hiked fast, half jogging, breath ragged. The trail felt longer this time. Every sound behind me made me flinch. At one point, I was sure I heard footsteps off to my right, but when I stopped, they stopped too. That scared me more than anything else. When I reached the clearing where I'd parked, I almost cried with relief. My SUV was untouched. I threw the pack in, got in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I hit a paved road. I didn't stop for gas, didn't eat, didn't even turn on the radio. just drove. Back home, I didn't talk about it. Not to friends, not online. I just deleted the GPS coordinates from my phone and threw the paper map in the trash. I had nightmares for weeks. Dreams about scratches in the rock, about being watched, about that silent pit full of bones. It's been a year. I still think about it. Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. Sure, I've heard that same scraping sound outside my window. I'll sit there in the dark, listening, breathing, waiting, but nothing ever comes. Still, I haven't gone camping again. Probably never will. I don't know who or what was out there near that abandoned quarry. I don't think I want to know. All I know is that something else had made that place home. Something that didn't want company. And I was lucky to leave when I did.